Amanirenas emerges from history not as a footnote, but as a disruption. She was a queen of Kush, a Kandake, a ruling woman whose authority was neither symbolic nor secondary. In a world dominated by empires that wrote history to justify conquest, Amanirenas stands as a rare figure who did not merely resist imperial power but openly humiliated it. Her confrontation with Rome at the height of its expansion under Augustus remains one of the clearest examples of African political and military agency in antiquity. The kingdom of Kush, centered in Nubia south of Egypt, was not a peripheral civilization. It was ancient, wealthy, militarily capable, and culturally confident. Kush had its own writing system, its own religious traditions, and a long-standing political structure in which women could rule as sovereigns. The title Kandake was not ceremonial. It denoted real executive power. Amanirenas ruled in a system where queens commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and embodied the state itself. By the late 1st century BCE, the Mediterranean world was undergoing radical transformation. Rome had just defeated Cleopatra VII and annexed Egypt. Augustus, newly established as emperor, sought stability, borders, and symbolic dominance. Egypt was not only a province, it was Rome's grain supply, a strategic jewel, and an ideological trophy. Control of Egypt meant control of the eastern Mediterranean. South of Egypt lay Kush. Rome viewed it ambiguously, not quite barbarian, not fully civilized by Roman standards, but undeniably powerful. Kush was not annexed. It was watched. Amanirenas ruled during this tense moment. Roman sources describe her as one-eyed, fierce, and commanding. These descriptions are not neutral observations. They are imperial reactions. Roman historians often reduced foreign rulers, especially women, to physical traits or caricatures as a way to diminish their authority. Yet even in distortion, their fear is visible. When Roman prefect Gaius Petronius attempted to assert influence southward, the Kushite response was not diplomatic hesitation, but armed resistance. Amanirenas led Kushite forces north into Roman-controlled Egypt. This was not a raid. It was a political statement. Her armies attacked Roman forts, captured territory, and seized statues of Augustus himself. One of these bronze heads was buried beneath a temple threshold in Kushite land, an unmistakable act of symbolic domination. Romans would walk above their emperor's image, literally under Kushite feet. This act alone reframes the narrative of Roman invincibility. Rome was not universally feared. It could be challenged, mocked, and forced into negotiation. Petronius retaliated with a Roman counteroffensive, pushing deep into Kushite territory and destroying the city of Napata, one of Kush's religious and political centers. Roman sources describe this as a decisive blow. It was not. Kushite power did not collapse. Amanirenas did not surrender. Instead, she regrouped, fortified her southern stronghold at Meroe, and prepared for prolonged resistance. Here, the story shifts from battlefield spectacle to political mastery. Amanirenas understood something Rome respected above all else: cost. Prolonged war in unfamiliar terrain, far from supply lines, against a population that would not submit was not profitable. Augustus wanted stability, not endless southern conflict, so Amanirenas did something extraordinary. She negotiated directly with Rome. The treaty that followed was not one of subjugation. Kush did not pay tribute. Rome withdrew from contested territories. Borders were stabilized in Kush's favor. For a non-Roman power, especially one ruled by an African woman, this was an unprecedented outcome. Rome, the empire that reshaped the Mediterranean, accepted limits imposed by Amanirenas. What makes this even more remarkable is how history tried to forget it. Amanirenas does not appear in the canonical narratives of Roman greatness. She is mentioned briefly, sometimes dismissively, never centered. Her victory does not fit the imperial story Rome wanted to tell about itself. And later historians inheriting Roman frameworks often repeated these silences, yet the archaeological record refuses to comply. The buried Augustus head exists. Kushite inscriptions confirm independent authority. The treaty's consequences are visible in the long peace that followed. Rome never attempted full conquest of Kush again. Amanirenas ruled not as an exception but as a product of a political culture that allowed women sovereign power. Her authority was not borrowed from a husband or son. She ruled in her own right, in her own name, with military and diplomatic control. This challenges multiple assumptions at once: that ancient Africa lacked centralized power, that women did not rule effectively, and that Rome's dominance was absolute. In Amanirenas, we see a ruler who understood symbolism, warfare, diplomacy, and empire psychology. She knew when to strike, when to retreat, and when to negotiate. She did not seek Rome's approval. She forced its recognition. Her story is not one of resistance alone. It is a story of victory without conquest, power without assimilation, and authority without imitation. And that is precisely why she was minimized. Because Amanirenas proves that empire was never the only model of civilization, and that Rome was not the only force capable of shaping history. The authority Amanirenas exercised did not emerge from anomaly. It was structural. To understand how a woman could confront Rome without her legitimacy being questioned at home, one must understand the political system of Kush itself. Unlike Rome, where female power existed only through family ties and informal influence, Kush institutionalized female sovereignty. The Kandake was not a consort, not a regent, and not a symbolic mother of the nation. She was the state. The Kandake system functioned as a parallel and sometimes dominant line of authority. In many periods of Kushite history, queens ruled jointly with kings or entirely independently. They commanded armies, presided over religious rituals, controlled taxation, and negotiated foreign policy. Their legitimacy did not depend on masculinity or exceptionality. It depended on lineage, competence, and divine sanction. Amanirenas ruled in a culture where female leadership was normalized. This fact is essential because it explains why her military decisions were not contested internally. She did not need to justify her authority to generals or priests. They already recognized it. The question was not whether she could rule, but how she would rule. Roman authors, writing from a society deeply anxious about female power, failed to comprehend this. They repeatedly emphasized Amanirenas' gender and physical appearance, describing her as one-eyed and savage. These descriptions were not historical observations, but ideological defenses. Rome explained resistance by dehumanizing it. A woman who defeated Roman interests had to be portrayed as unnatural. Yet her strategies reveal precision rather than savagery. Amanirenas did not seek full-scale conquest of Roman Egypt. That would have been unsustainable. Instead, she targeted visibility. Roman border forts were attacked not only for their strategic value but for their symbolic weight. These forts represented Roman permanence. By breaching them, Amanirenas demonstrated that Roman presence in Africa was conditional. The capture of Augustus's statues was not incidental. Roman emperors cultivated their images as extensions of power. Statues were not decorations. They were political instruments. To seize the emperor's likeness was to challenge his authority directly. To bury it beneath a temple threshold was to invert the imperial hierarchy. This act communicated multiple messages simultaneously. To Kushites, it affirmed sovereignty and divine favor. To Romans, it signaled contempt. To neighboring peoples, it demonstrated that Rome was not untouchable. When Petronius advanced south and destroyed Napata, Rome believed it had delivered a decisive blow. Napata was ancient, sacred, and symbolically central. Its destruction was meant to break Kushite morale. Instead, it revealed Roman misunderstanding. Kush was not a single city-state. Its political center had already shifted south to Meroe. Napata mattered culturally, but its loss did not paralyze governance. Amanirenas adapted. She did not pursue a costly attempt to retake Napata immediately. Instead, she consolidated defenses, relocated strategic resources, and prepared for a war of attrition. Rome could destroy cities. It could not erase geography. Southern Kush was difficult terrain for Roman armies. Supply lines stretched thin. Climate, distance, and unfamiliar conditions eroded Roman advantages. Every mile south increased Roman vulnerability. Amanirenas understood this asymmetry and exploited it, but perhaps her most underestimated skill was timing. She did not prolong war for the sake of pride. She recognized the moment when Rome was most willing to negotiate. Augustus was focused on internal consolidation, frontier stability, and projecting an image of controlled expansion. A prolonged African war contradicted that image. It drained resources without offering clear gains. Amanirenas forced Rome into a choice: endless conflict on unfavorable terms, or negotiated peace with a sovereign African power. The treaty that followed was extraordinary. Kush retained its independence. Rome withdrew from contested zones. No tribute was demanded. Borders were fixed in a way that acknowledged Kushite authority. Roman Egypt remained secure but not expanded. This outcome contradicts the usual narrative of Roman diplomacy, which often disguised domination as agreement. In this case, Rome compromised because it had to. What followed was not a temporary ceasefire, but a lasting stability. For decades, the Roman-Kushite border remained peaceful. Trade flowed. Diplomatic contact continued. Rome never again attempted deep military penetration into Kush. This silence is telling. Rome remembered where it had been checked. Amanirenas disappears from the written record after these events. We do not know the year of her death. We do not know the details of her succession. This absence is not accidental. It reflects the priorities of the sources that survived. Roman historians wrote about Rome. Kushite records were less likely to endure colonial transmission, yet her impact is measurable precisely through absence. The lack of further Roman campaigns is evidence. The endurance of Kushite sovereignty is evidence. The archaeological continuity of Meroe is evidence. Amanirenas did not build an empire. She did something more subversive. She defined limits. She demonstrated that Rome could be resisted without mimicry, without assimilation, and without collapse. She ruled without adopting Roman models of governance or legitimacy. Her authority remained Kushite, African, and autonomous. In later centuries, histories written under imperial frameworks struggled to place her. She did not fit the categories of defeated enemy or assimilated ally. She was neither conquered nor absorbed, so she was minimized. But Amanirenas stands as proof that global antiquity was not a one-directional story of expansion. From center to periphery, power moved in multiple directions. Authority was contested. Outcomes were negotiated, and sometimes empire learned where to stop. After the treaty with Rome, Amanirenas did something that confounded imperial logic. She disappeared from spectacle. There were no triumphal monuments proclaiming victory over Rome, no propagandistic inscriptions announcing Kushite superiority, no attempt to immortalize herself through excess display. Instead, Kush entered a long period of stability. Borders held, trade resumed, war ended. This absence of spectacle has often been misread as historical disappearance. It was not. It was strategy. Empires rely on visibility. Rome asserted dominance through roads, statues, architecture, and texts that constantly reminded subjects of imperial presence. Amanirenas chose the opposite. She secured sovereignty and then withdrew from imperial theater. Her success did not need constant repetition. It was embedded in reality. This is one of the reasons her legacy became vulnerable to erasure. History, as it was later written, favored expansion, conquest, and collapse. It privileged dramatic rises and catastrophic falls. Amanirenas offered neither. She did not conquer Rome, and she was not conquered by it. She forced Rome to stop, and then she ruled quietly. For imperial historiography, this was an uncomfortable outcome. Roman authors had little incentive to elaborate on a war that ended without Roman victory. Their narratives moved quickly past Kush, framing the campaign as a minor, frontier disturbance rather than a serious geopolitical challenge. By minimizing the conflict, they minimized the humiliation. Silence became damage control. Later historians inherited this imbalance. Roman sources survived in abundance. Kushite voices did not. The written records of Meroe, composed in the Meroitic script, remain only partially deciphered. As a result, the historical conversation defaulted to Rome's perspective, even when Rome had lost control of the situation. Amanirenas was not forgotten because she was insignificant. She was forgotten because she was inconvenient. Her rule contradicts several assumptions that underlie classical history. She demonstrates that African states were not passive recipients of Mediterranean influence. She demonstrates that women could wield formal, militarized sovereignty without social collapse. She demonstrates that Rome could be checked by a power it did not fully understand. And perhaps most importantly, she demonstrates that survival without assimilation is a form of victory. Kush did not Romanize itself after the treaty. It did not adopt Roman law, Roman religion, or Roman political structures. Meroe continued to develop its own artistic styles, burial practices, and religious expressions. Its pyramids, smaller and steeper than Egyptian ones, multiplied across the landscape. Its economy adapted. Its political culture endured. Amanirenas' legacy is therefore not located in a single monument or text. It is located in continuity. This form of legacy is difficult to narrate within imperial frameworks. It lacks the drama of conquest. It lacks the tragedy of annihilation. It exists instead as a sustained refusal. In modern times, Amanirenas has been rediscovered unevenly. She appears in academic discussions of Roman frontier policy, in archaeological studies of Nubia, and occasionally in popular retellings that frame her as an exotic curiosity. Too often, her gender is emphasized at the expense of her governance, as if her significance lies primarily in exception rather than competence. This framing misses the point. Amanirenas does not matter because she was a woman who fought Rome. She matters because she was a ruler who understood power precisely enough to limit an empire. Her story also exposes how historical memory is structured. Figures who build empires are remembered. Figures who define boundaries are not. Yet boundaries shape history just as profoundly as expansion. Knowing where power stops is as important as knowing where it begins. Today, as discussions of empire, resistance, and historical voice continue to evolve, Amanirenas offers a corrective. She reminds us that antiquity was not a monologue spoken by Rome and Greece. It was a dialogue, often violent, often unequal, but never one-sided. She ruled in a world that tried to overwrite her. She forced recognition without surrender. And then she allowed silence to do the rest. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of a border that holds. After the treaty with Rome, Kush did not retreat into obscurity. What followed was not decline, but consolidation. This distinction matters because much of later historical interpretation mistakes the absence of Roman conflict for weakness. In reality, the period after Amanirenas was one of internal stabilization, economic recalibration, and cultural self-definition. Meroe, already the effective capital during Amanirenas' reign, became the uncontested center of Kushite power. Its location was strategic. Farther south than Napata, it sat beyond the immediate reach of Roman military projection. At the same time, it remained connected to Red Sea trade routes, sub-Saharan exchange networks, and Nile-based commerce. Kush was not isolated. It was repositioned. The decades following Amanirenas show no evidence of Roman political intrusion. This is not accidental. Rome respected borders only when forced to. In Kush, it had learned the cost of overextension. Rome and Egypt remained vital, but the southern frontier was treated with caution. Garrisons stayed north. Diplomatic contact replaced military ambition. This restraint allowed Kush to redirect resources inward. Iron production expanded around Meroe. The region became one of the most significant iron working centers in ancient Africa. Weapons, tools, and agricultural implements were produced locally at scale. This mattered not only economically but politically. A state that controls its own metal, production controls its capacity for defense and development. Kush did not depend on Roman supply chains. It did not need them. Agriculture intensified along the Nile and its tributaries. Irrigation systems were maintained and expanded. Surplus supported urban populations, craft specialization, and long-distance trade. Meroe grew not as a colonial imitation, but as an indigenous urban form, blending monumental architecture with local materials and aesthetics. Religious life continued to evolve independently. Kushite deities remained central. Temples were rebuilt, expanded, and reinterpreted. Egyptian influence, long present in Nubia, persisted but did not dominate. Kush did not revert to imitation. It absorbed selectively, reshaping symbols to serve local cosmology and political identity. This cultural confidence is visible in burial practices. The pyramids of Meroe multiplied during this period. Smaller, steeper, and more numerous than their Egyptian predecessors, they were unmistakably Kushite. They were not statements of nostalgia, but of continuity. Kush remembered its past without freezing itself within it. Amanirenas' role in enabling this continuity cannot be overstated. By securing peace without subjugation, she ensured that Kush would not be forced into the Roman world system as a subordinate node. Trade with Rome continued, but on negotiated terms. Exchange did not equal absorption. What is striking is how little Rome appears in Kushite material culture after the treaty. Roman goods are present, but not dominant. Roman imagery does not overwrite local iconography. There is no sudden Romanization of elite identity. Kushite rulers did not adopt Roman titles, dress, or political symbolism. This absence is itself evidence of autonomy. In many frontier regions, Rome's presence reshaped local elites. Provincial rulers mimicked Roman styles to legitimize their power. In Kush, this did not occur. Authority continued to derive from indigenous traditions, divine sanction, and lineage. Amanirenas had demonstrated that Roman recognition was not a prerequisite for legitimacy. The Kandake system persisted after her. Women continued to hold significant power within Kushite governance. While individual reigns varied, the institutional precedent remained intact. Amanirenas was not an anomaly that closed with her death. She was a confirmation of an existing structure. Yet despite this stability, Kush slowly faded from Mediterranean historical consciousness. This fading was not sudden. It unfolded over centuries, shaped by shifting trade routes, environmental pressures, and the eventual rise of new regional powers. But it was also shaped by narrative neglect. Rome wrote history expansively when it conquered and briefly when it failed. Kush, having resisted successfully and then disengaged, fell into a narrative gap. It was neither enemy nor province. It did not fit Roman categories of significance. Later, As Islamic polities reshaped North Africa and the Nile corridor, older histories were filtered through new frameworks. Kush became a distant predecessor, its political achievements overshadowed by later civilizations. By the time European scholars began reconstructing African antiquity, they encountered Kush primarily through ruins and Roman references. And Roman references, when they existed, were sparse and dismissive. Amanirenas survived this process only partially. Her name appears briefly, distorted, framed through Roman anxiety. She is remembered as a problem, not as a ruler. The structures she defended are rarely attributed to her success. This separation of outcome from agency is one of the most common mechanisms of historical erasure. Kush remained independent for centuries after Amanirenas, yet she is rarely credited as the architect of that independence. Stability is often attributed to geography or circumstance rather than leadership. But geography does not negotiate treaties. Circumstance does not humiliate emperors. Individuals do. Amanirenas shaped the conditions under which Kush could endure. She did not attempt to redefine the world. She defined a boundary within it. That boundary held not because it was written into Roman law, but because Rome internalized its cost. In this sense, Amanirenas' most lasting legacy is not what she built, but what she prevented. She prevented annexation. She prevented cultural erasure. She prevented the transformation of Kush into a Roman periphery, and she did so without turning Kush into a militarized state permanently oriented toward war. After conflict came governance. After resistance came continuity. This pattern stands in stark contrast to imperial narratives that equate survival with conquest or collapse. Kush survived by refusing both. As centuries passed, Meroe would eventually decline, shaped by environmental shifts, economic changes, and the rise of new regional dynamics. But this decline was not the consequence of Rome. It unfolded on Kush's own terms, long after Amanirenas had vanished from the record. That too matters, because it means Rome did not get the last word. Amanirenas did not vanish from history by accident. Her reduction was structured, gradual, and methodical. It followed patterns that recur whenever historical power is forced to acknowledge limits imposed by those it intended to dominate. When empire cannot erase an opponent through conquest, it erases them through narrative. The first layer of this erasure begins with Roman sources themselves. Roman historians wrote to reinforce Roman order. Their works were not neutral chronicles, but ideological instruments. They celebrated victories, justified expansion, and reframed failures as minor disturbances. The campaign against Kush did not fit the Roman self-image. It was costly, inconclusive, and humiliating. As a result, it was minimized. Amanirenas appears briefly, often reduced to physical description. She is described as one-eyed, fierce, aggressive. These descriptors serve a purpose. They shift attention away from her political competence and toward her body. Roman writers could not easily admit that a foreign ruler had outmaneuvered them diplomatically. By framing her as a savage anomaly, they preserved Roman superiority in the abstract, even as they conceded it in practice. Gender amplified this distortion. A woman exercising open military and diplomatic authority directly challenged Roman gender ideology. Roman society tolerated influential women only when their power was indirect, hidden within family structures, or framed as moral corruption. A sovereign queen commanding armies violated these boundaries. The easiest response was caricature. This is the first mechanism of silencing, reduction to spectacle. The second mechanism is omission. After the treaty, Roman attention shifts elsewhere. Kush becomes peripheral in Roman texts, not because it ceased to matter, but because Rome chose not to remember where it had been checked. Silence becomes a tool of control. What is not recorded appears insignificant, even when it was decisive. This asymmetry deepened over time. Kushite written traditions did not survive colonial transmission in the same way Roman texts did. The Meroitic script remains only partially deciphered. not because Kush lacked literacy, but because later historical systems did not prioritize preserving African archives. What survived was what empire valued. As a result, modern historians inherited a skewed archive. Early European scholarship approached African antiquity through a colonial lens. Africa was framed as reactive rather than generative, peripheral rather than central. When powerful African figures appeared in the record, they were often treated as exceptions requiring explanation. Amanirenas was no different. She was framed as remarkable because she defied expectations, rather than as evidence that those expectations were wrong. This framing created a trap. To highlight her power, historians emphasized her rarity. To explain her success, they searched for external influences. Was she Egyptianized? Was Kush merely an extension of Nile civilization? Was Rome unusually weak at the time? Each question subtly shifted agency away from her and her society. This is the third mechanism of erasure, conditional recognition. Amanirenas is acknowledged, but only under constraints that preserve broader assumptions about power. She can be strong, but only briefly. She can be successful, but only because Rome was distracted. She can rule, but only because Kush was exceptional. The possibility that African political systems produced effective sovereignty as a norm remains resisted. In popular retellings, another distortion emerges: exoticization. Amanirenas becomes a visual spectacle rather than a political actor. Her story is filtered through imagery of mystery, darkness, and otherness. Her power is aestheticized rather than analyzed. This transformation makes her safe. An exotic figure does not challenge contemporary power structures. A strategist does. Exoticization is not celebration. It is containment. What disappears in this process is her intellectual agency. Amanirenas was not simply brave or defiant. She was calculating. She understood imperial psychology. She identified Rome's vulnerabilities not on the battlefield alone, but in its need for symbolic dominance and stable borders. She exploited these needs precisely. Her decision to negotiate when she did was not capitulation, it was timing. She did not seek total victory because total victory was unnecessary. She sought recognition of limits. Rome conceded them. This level of strategic clarity is rarely attributed to ancient African rulers in mainstream narratives. When it is often attributed to intuition rather than analysis. This distinction matters. Intuition is personal. Analysis implies system, education, and institutional knowledge. Amanirenas threatens not only imperial narratives, but also modern hierarchies of knowledge. Her story suggests that political rationality did not flow outward from Greece and Rome to the rest of the world. It existed independently, developing in parallel. Kush did not need Roman models to understand diplomacy, deterrence, or statecraft. It practiced them on its own terms. This realization destabilizes long-standing assumptions embedded in global historical consciousness. It challenges the idea that power, governance, and strategic thought are products of a single civilizational lineage. Amanirenas stands as evidence of multiplicity, and multiplicity is difficult to integrate into linear historical narratives. So she is narrowed, simplified, contained within a few paragraphs. Her confrontation with Rome is treated as a footnote rather than a turning point. The centuries of Kushite independence that followed are disconnected from her actions. This disconnection is perhaps the most profound erasure of all, because it allows history to acknowledge her existence while denying her consequence. Yet consequence is precisely where her significance lies. Rome learned where to stop. Kush learned that it could enforce that stop. Later, African polities inherited a landscape shaped by that boundary. The Roman-African frontier was not inevitable. It was negotiated, resisted, and fixed through agency. Amanirenas was central to that process. To restore her to history is not simply to add a forgotten name. It is to reconfigure how power is understood in antiquity. It is to accept that empire was not destiny, that resistance was not futile, and that sovereignty did not require imitation. Her erasure was not the result of silence alone, but of discomfort. She represents a world in which dominance was contested successfully and then quietly maintained. And history, written by those who prefer inevitability, has never known what to do with that. Amanirenas matters now because the world she confronted never disappeared. Empire did not end with Rome, it changed vocabulary. It learned to justify itself differently. Where Rome built roads and legions, later powers built institutions, narratives, and economic dependencies. But the logic remained the same: expansion framed as order, domination framed as progress, resistance framed as chaos. What Amanirenas represents is not merely resistance to empire, but resistance to inevitability. Empires survive by convincing both themselves and others that their expansion is natural, necessary, and ultimately beneficial. Rome believed this. Augustus believed this. The idea that the world should be organized under Roman authority was not presented as conquest, but as civilization. Those who opposed it were described as obstacles to order. Amanirenas rejected that premise entirely. She did not argue that Kush should join Rome on better terms. She did not attempt to reform Rome from within. She did not seek inclusion. She asserted separation. Her position was not that Rome was evil, but that Rome was limited. This distinction is crucial. Most resistance narratives are framed as moral oppositions: good versus evil, freedom versus tyranny. Amanirenas' confrontation was more unsettling. She treated Rome as one power among others, not as the axis of history. She denied Rome the status of inevitability. This is why her story remains politically uncomfortable. Modern power structures are still built on claims of inevitability. Global systems present themselves as the only viable option. Economic models, political alliances, cultural norms are framed as universal. Even when they emerge from specific histories, those who resist are described as backward, irrational, or destabilizing. Amanirenas exposes this pattern as ancient. She demonstrates that power can be confronted not by outmatching it everywhere, but by understanding where it cannot afford to lose. Rome could conquer cities. It could not afford endless instability on its southern border. It could not justify perpetual war in Africa to its own elite. It could not erase Kush without cost. Amanirenas identified these limits and forced Rome to acknowledge them. This form of power does not rely on spectacle. It relies on clarity. In contemporary terms, she practiced strategic restraint. She escalated only when escalation mattered. She withdrew when withdrawal preserved advantage. She negotiated not from weakness, but from leverage. She accepted peace not as compromise, but as consolidation. These are not the instincts of rebellion. They are the skills of governance. Yet governance by non-imperial actors is rarely celebrated. History favors those who expand, not those who hold. It favors those who leave ruins, not those who leave borders intact. Amanirenas left no empire behind her. She left something more difficult to see, a refusal that worked. Her gender intensifies this discomfort. A woman who rules quietly, effectively, and without assimilation disrupts multiple hierarchies at once. She challenges the idea that authority must be masculine. She challenges the idea that leadership must be visible. She challenges the idea that power must replicate itself endlessly to be legitimate. Amanirenas did none of these things. She ruled, she defended, she negotiated, and then she allowed normalcy to return. This kind of leadership does not translate easily into heroic mythology. It does not end with coronations or catastrophes. It ends with stability, and stability is often invisible. The modern rediscovery of Amanirenas is therefore not just an academic correction. It is a political act. To tell her story fully is to question how historical value is assigned. It is to ask why conquest is remembered more readily than restraint, why expansion is seen as strength while limitation is seen as failure. Amanirenas invites a different metric. By her metric, success is measured by survival without surrender, autonomy without isolation, and peace without subordination. This metric has contemporary relevance. In a world where power still seeks to present itself as universal, Amanirenas reminds us that universality is often a claim rather than a fact. Alternatives exist. They have always existed. They have simply been written out. Her erasure was not total, it was selective. Enough remained to be rediscovered, but not enough to be comfortable. That discomfort is productive. It forces reevaluation. She cannot be neatly absorbed into imperial history as a conquered enemy. She cannot be celebrated as a romantic rebel without stripping her of agency. She cannot be reduced to symbolism without losing her intelligence. She resists simplification. This resistance mirrors the one she enacted in life. Amanirenas does not offer a story of overthrowing empire. She offers something more sustainable, a story of stopping it, of telling power that it does not extend everywhere, of demonstrating that dominance has geography, cost, and limits. This is why Rome never returned. Not because Kush was invisible, but because it was understood. In the end, Amanirenas does not stand as a symbol of anti-imperial rage. She stands as a model of post-imperial clarity. She shows what it looks like to confront dominance without becoming defined by it. Her silence after victory was not absence. It was control. Her lack of monuments was not forgetfulness. It was confidence. Her disappearance from spectacle was not weakness. It was the final assertion of sovereignty. And history, which prefers noise to restraint, struggled to remember her because she refused to perform power in familiar ways. Yet the borders she held endured longer than many empires that celebrated themselves endlessly. That is her legacy, not empire against empire, but limit against inevitability. And that is why Amanirenas still matters.